Good morning and welcome. I'm Mackenzie Babb, External Affairs Director for the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. I am so pleased to welcome you to Hitting the Brakes, Looking for Cracks, the latest in our series of monthly press briefings on the state of our economy. This and future briefings on the topic will coincide with the release of the Labor Department's monthly jobs report, which typically falls on the first Friday of the month. Today's conversation will be led by Kenan Institute Chief Economist, Professor Gerald Cohen. I'll be handing things over to Professor Cohen here momentarily, but before I do that, I'd like to provide a bit of a roadmap for what to expect from today's conversation. For the next 15 minutes or so, Professor Cohen will provide his analysis and insight of this morning's jobs report. We'll then spend the second half of our time together fielding your questions. You are welcome to submit those anytime using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. For those joining by phone, you're welcome to email those questions to me. My email address is mackenzie_babb@kenan-flagler.unc.edu. We will aim to get to as many of those questions as we can before we wrap at 9:30 Eastern. So with that, it is my pleasure to hand things over to my friend and colleague, Kenan Institute Chief Economist, Professor Gerald Cohen. Professor Cohen?
It's great to be here on what is a quite interesting morning. I think these days every employment report is quite strong, or is quite notable. So let me start my presentation. So the question is, are we seeing cracks in the economy? Is the economy breaking with an AKE or breaking with an EAK? And I will say that the headlines suggest very few cracks in the economy. As you can see in this table, payrolls were up 263,000, in line with expectations, or slightly above expectations. And the unemployment rate declined from 3.7 to 3.5%. We're basically at the 50-year lows that we touched back in 2019, and then we've kind of been flirting around with that number. But the details are a little bit more mixed, and I think that's where I think in some respects you could say the Fed and the markets are will be reacting to. So as I said, the headline numbers were quite strong. 263,000. Expectations were for 260,000. This chart illustrates that we are on a slowing path, but I just want to be clear that 263,000 is very strong relative to kind of demographics where you'd expect less than 100,000 workers per month. Though you could say we've made up the levels from we're past the peak from pre-COVID, but if you expected some continued employment, from then which you would, given the economy would be expected to grow, then you could say we're still making up that difference. But these numbers are still quite strong relative to history. But as I indicate, and then previous months were revised a net 11,000. That's not a big deal. If you had seen a plus number, if you had seen negative revisions, that would worry me a lot more, but they were positive. But the details were much more mixed. What we saw was actually a big increase in leisure and hospitality, which is a positive, up 83,000. But we saw declines in retail employment, in financial employment, so interest rates hitting the financial sector. So fewer mortgage applications, so less hiring and in particular in those areas where you're seeing related to household lent, to home mortgages, things like that. And then also transport and warehousing, which is used to be, we think that is as important as these days as retail hiring, because it's an indication of partially where consumer spending goes, given the likes of Amazon. So a slowdown in that as well, or a decline in that as well. So that's where the mixed picture comes. So you're kind of seeing what the Fed, what I would say, and the Fed is looking at is they'll say, we're starting to see the impact of our higher interest rates through slowdowns in retail spending, through slowdowns in finance. You didn't see much in construction remained, construction spending continue to grow. So, but a couple of areas where you saw some weakness. So I mean, and this reflects the push and pull in terms of the housing markets. We have, so we are still supply constraints on housing, but higher interest rates are raising the cost of buying a home, and so that is putting, put some downward pressure on construction. So you kind of have this push of construction still being in demand, housing still being in demand from a demographic standpoint, but the pull of higher interest rates softening that demand. And one of the important metrics that we look at are hours, or the number of hours that are being, the number of hours that are being, the amount of hours that the economy is or that employers or employees are going to work for. Sorry, the cat caught my tongue. And what that means is, if you think about the GDP, basically output in the economy reflects two things: the number of hours that are in the, that employees are working, and then so it's people times hours. Their weekly hours are roughly 34, 35. That doesn't change that much, so it's really reflecting increases in employment, and then the productivity of those people. So what you can do is you can say, well, we now have the 3 months of the third quarter, and now those hours are up 2.4% for the third quarter, which suggests GDP growth should be positive, should return to a positive number in the third quarter. Although this indicator was also quite positive in the first and second quarters, which is why I'm very definitive that we were not in a recession in the first half of the year, despite GDP declines. And this data suggests that we are not in a recession in the third quarter. But the cracks that we're seeing are suggesting there is some breaking, AKE, in the economy, so that those declines in retail, those declines in financial, those declines in trucking and warehousing. But at least in the third quarter, we expect positive growth, a return to positive growth, and the data suggests no recession. The unemployment rate declined back down to 3.5%. That's a 50-year low. Again, there was kind of a mixed picture. Interestingly, the labor force, the labor force declined by 57,000, and labor force participation rate edged down slightly from 62.4 to 62.3%. That was because the labor force actually fell by 57,000. Now it was up over 750,000 in the previous month. So there's a lot of volatility in this survey. It's a survey of households, of 60,000 households. And so, from month to month, you can see this volatility. But the reason why the unemployment rate declined, you could say, is not a positive, because there was a big increase in employment, or sometimes it will rise, as it did last month, because there was an increase in the labor force. I know that's complicated math, but they take the number of unemployed and the labor force. So you can see the labor force, the unemployment rate move around, because of changes in the labor force or change in the number of unemployed. In this case, the labor force declined, and that's the reason why the unemployment rate declined to back down to its 50-year low. But it's kind of been hovering, and again, it's a little crack, not a lot on the employment side. Just to note, as this title said, or as the slide says, there are two ways that you can loosen the labor market, really, which is what the Fed wants to do. You can either increase the number of people working by increasing the labor force, or you can have a recession, you can kill demand. So this report suggests more of the, I don't want to say recession, but more of the slowing part of the killing demand part or hurting demand than the increase in the number of people working. Wage growth continues to be quite strong relative to history. Wages were up 0.3% for the month, 5% on a year-on-year basis. That's a little bit of a slowing from the 5.1. That's this blue line kind of ticked down, but it's still below inflation. And this is where the worry is for the Fed, that you're going to get this wage price spiral where people are going to say, look, inflation is high, I need to ask for wage increases, which is justified, but if it kind of feeds itself into the economy as a whole. So the fact that we're not seeing a major acceleration in wages and they're kind of range bound on a year-on-year basis, I think is again a positive for the Fed. So something, if I'm looking at, if I'm saying a pros and cons for the Fed, the headline number suggests more tightening for the Fed. The details suggest maybe that they're getting the job or working on getting the job done. This hourly earnings kind of is suggestive of that as well. If I look at if I turn to kind of forward-looking indicators, the temp help is a really nice forward-looking indicator, and it was actually up 27,000 for the month, kind of an acceleration from the last few months, although we've seen in this longer term, an acceleration from the last few months. And that's, when people hire temp help workers, it's kind of the path to employment. So, it suggests that demand is strong, and that they're saying, look, I'm willing to, hire somebody that's temporary. One of the challenges these days is, given the shortage of labor, it could just be the temp help firms were able to find more labor, and therefore the firms or businesses that were looking for temp help were able to hire them. So it's hard to tell the supply versus the demand constraints. But this temp help number is a suggestive of, again, on the positive side of the economy. The negative side for the Fed is suggestive of continued strength in the economy. As I mentioned, the biggest gain and kind of offset from the negative was an increase in leisure and hospitality, up 83,000 for the month, but it still remains, 1.1 million below the pre-COVID peak. This means the rest of employment is much stronger, because we were now a couple 100,000 above the pre-COVID peak. And so again, this is the push and pull in the economy. So perhaps what we're seeing, and this is the suggests, again, continued strength in the economy, is people shifting to taking vacations, hiring for restaurants. You have those workers that are available, and this suggests continued growth in income and continued growth in spending. And so maybe this is kind of how we get the soft landing. You're seeing some slowing in areas where there are substantial supply constraints, such as construction, such as autos, where you're starting to see some of those supply constraints being softened, but then also a change in people's demand from those towards taking vacations and going for restaurants. And as long as we're getting the workers to fill those jobs, then that you'll get a nice you can potentially get a soft landing. So that's kind of the soft landing scenario. Another area that's worth noting is there's just been a lot of talk about tech. And all this discussion of hiring freezes and layoffs and things like that. And I just want to point out that you are seeing some slowing in tech employment, but it is still growing, up 10,000 this month roughly, and kind of and around the same in the previous months. There were actually downward revisions in the previous month, so it's not as strong as what I had thought yesterday. but we're still getting, despite all this bad news, strength in the tech sector. So I think I'm actually out of time. Let me just, before we open it up to Q&A, I just want to kind of provide a sneak preview about a new initiative that we are launching later this month, and we hope that you'll tune in. We have a project that is going to provide up-to-the-minute economic data and analysis on a local basis for towns, cities, and counties across the country. This is something that data is not available on a timely basis, and it's going to help support policymakers, business leaders, and other decision makers in making localized policy. And so we're really excited about this initiative, and we hope that you tune in as we roll it out. So hope to see you in the next few weeks to discuss this, and also and that you tune in, and we'll be discussing it next month in terms of some of the details. So let me stop there and open it up to Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. Your insightful analysis and wordplay and cat idioms hit the trifecta for me today, and I'm sure they did for many of our participants. We've already had some great questions rolling in, but if I could, before we get to those, just add to the plug that Professor Cohen provided. This new project that we're launching is going to be released October 18th, but you'll be hearing more from us on this likely next week, and from my colleague, Rob Knapp. So be on the lookout for more. If you'd like access to embargoed results and findings, or early access to interview any of our experts on this hyper-localized data that really takes a look at the microeconomies that are driving the growth and contraction that we're seeing across the US, please reach out. I think that my colleague Rob Knapp is going to drop his contact information in the chat. So please do contact him if you'd like to be part of that discussion. With that, we're going to hop right into Q&A. As a reminder for those who've just joined, you are welcome to submit your Q&A using that Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen. I see we've already got great questions in the queue. For those joining by phone, you can email your questions to me, Mackenzie_Babb@Kenan-Flagler.unc.edu. We're going to try to prioritize questions from the press as much as we can. So if you'd like your question prioritized, be sure you include your title and affiliation. We're going to start with a question from Chris Faulkner McDonald. How worrying is the slowdown in the low productivity service sector? Manufacturing payrolls are continuing to grow, suggesting that investment growth is likely to continue into Q4.
So Chris, that's a great question, and I think that one of the challenges that we've been seeing is that the last few quarters of data have suggested that we have the strong employment and we have those growth in hours that I kept fumbling about, which is really the key metric. It's not just employment, but it's whether people are working, at least the same number of hours. But GDP has been declining, which basically means that productivity has been declining. That's just the math of it. And ultimately productivity is the key to growth and living standards. That's what we need to create. That's what living standards are based on. That not just people working more, but people being more productive, producing more. The challenge with the productivity numbers is on a quarter-to-quarter basis, they're quite volatile. And as you indicate, the service sector tends to be lower productivity. If I think about my barber, the technology doesn't change that much. You still need a barber, kind of with scissors, or maybe now you have an electronic buzz thing, but that's like the biggest change in technology. It's still, so maybe it takes a little less time to get your hair cut, but there's not that much different. And so in some respects, I think what's happening is and leisure and hospitality is an example where you are seeing, tends to be a low productivity sector. And so, again, if you think about waiters and people in restaurants and people working in hotels, there's not that much you can do, to raise productivity there. So the increase in those sectors suggests, continued slow employment growth, slow productivity growth. The flip side is if you're growing manufacturing, which tends to be a high productivity sector, you could see some increases in productivity. And as those supply chains get lessened, you could see great gains in productivity, which is positive for the economy. So I don't know if I have a good answer to your question. I think there's a bit of a push and pull. And I'm sorry that I keep focusing on this, but economists have to have two hands. And so I think that as the supply chains are softening, that should help productivity growth. As you said, manufacturing is growing, that should help productivity growth. But as you're growing more in the service sector, especially those areas like leisure and hospitality, those tend to have lower productivity growth. The flip side is, and maybe the tech sector is a very high, those computer programmers are extremely high productivity. So if you're seeing a slowdown there, and maybe that's where you were going, that's a negative for the economy. So again, push and pull.
Great, thank you, Professor Cohen. That leads really well into the next question that I'm going to pose from Lauren Onesorge. I hope I got that right, from the Triangle Business Journal. Can you elaborate a bit more on the tech job market? Obviously, that's a big sector in the Triangle. How should tech CEOs and employees be looking at these numbers?
So I think, again, this is something where if you cut through all the negative news, you can see some still positive signs, that the fact is that employment is growing in the tech sector, at least the measures that I found. And the employment numbers don't have a tech sector. They have an information sector, they have a business services sector. And what I did is I dug into the details of those data and found like the computer programmers and the people that run websites. And those numbers, as I said, are up 10,000, a slowing from the previous months, but still growing. The question is, and how much of those layoff announcements and hiring freezes, and is it just in place, the big names that are worried about that are seeing some slowing in declines in equity prices and worry about some profitability, is that going to lead to a wholesale slowdown in or declines in tech employment? The Triangle has a particularly interesting dilemma because we're having a lot of these tech sectors moving into the region, and the question is, and that's feeding strong demand for housing, has a lot of knock-on effects in terms of employment in the retail sector and restaurants. If these companies decide that they are not coming into the region, that could be a big negative. There's been no announcements about that. I think every impression that I'm getting is that that's full speed ahead. But that's the word. If you ask me, what do I worry about in the Triangle? That's what worries me, that they decide to change their plans.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Stephen Hicks. Does the temp help increase capture, or is it influenced by the growing gig worker economy or flexible workforce through contracting?
So temp help is a very specific measure. They basically are surveying temp help companies. So I can't remember the big temp help company off the top of my head, but like they are serving those companies that it's not the gig workers. The challenge with employment with gig workers is, for example, if you ask Uber what their employment numbers, they're not going to tell you their drivers, because those are contractors. They're going to tell you, they're software developers in San Francisco. Where we capture the gig employment is through that unemployment rate, that household survey, not the survey of employers. This is something that I think that the government statisticians are trying to work through, but because this is, as we move to more and more contract workers, it's harder to measure that. We hopefully believe that we're getting enough through that employment survey. And maybe this slowdown, and again, the unemployment rate fell, but you saw a slowdown, but that was because of the decline in the labor force. maybe that slowdown is indicative of a slowdown in gig workers. We don't really know enough from that survey to say that. So this is the challenge. And by the way, this challenge was we saw it during COVID, because those folks don't, it's not a normal, the way that they file for unemployment insurance. It's kind of, you don't have kind of their work history, so you don't really you only know that through their tax data, which takes a while. So that's one of the challenges of measuring gig employment.
Great, thank you. Thomas Stout wants to know how you think the Fed might react.
So I mean, let me be very clear. I don't have any. I wish I was in at the Federal Reserve building at the moment, because I'm sure it would be an interesting conversation. If I'm reading the data correctly, I think they are saying kind of, I would say that they think this is a net positive, as it were, going towards a slowing the economy. That's really what they want to see at this point. Unfortunately, that's what they want to see because of the inflation numbers. And so I think that they're going to look past the headlines and say the details suggest a bit more slowing than the positive headlines. And so I don't think that's going to change what they're doing in over the next two meetings. The expectations are 75 base or another 1.25% by the end of the year. Expectations by market participants are for 0.75 percentage point at the meeting. I'm running a blank. It's the end of this month, early November, and then another 0.5 percentage point in December. I don't think that's going to change this, but maybe that'll be their stopping point. Versus expectations right now or expectations as of before this report, that they would continue to go all the way into early 2023.
Excellent, thank you. We've got another great question that came in from Barbara Senec or Senech. I'm gonna try to learn that one. And I'm gonna try to power through it real quick. I think this is the last question we'll have time for. Barbara says, I continue to hear about policies, both government and private, that are intended to provide income to people who are not working or who are working in low paid fields. Universal income, lengthening of unemployment benefits, substantial increases in food support through SNAP and WIC are only a few. Even Amazon is now offering half-price Prime for anyone on public assistance. Acquaintances who are eligible for these programs are quite frank that these make them less likely to work or less likely to seek better jobs, lest they lose the benefits. How much will these practices drive long-term decreases in the labor force?
So the research on this is less is kind of pushback on that kind of view that people are disincentivized. There is this challenge. I mean, or maybe I should say that there are people that are disincentivized, but the flip side is that people that need the support, what you're doing is you're helping them both in terms of maintaining, their existence, and keeping people housed there. And we actually had a conference at a conference last week, there was a paper about this very issue that, people who lose their housing, or become, it really affects their employment. It's really hard to get to maintain steady employment when you don't have a home to go back to, or when you're always kind of looking for where you're going to live next. And so I think that you want to support people, you want to give them food to eat, but you also want to incentivize employment. And so there is again a challenge of how to do that. There are areas where you're right at the point where you lose your benefits go down if you get a new job. Or get a higher paying job, and it depends on whether you go over that hump or not. But I think that in general, for many people, getting those benefits helps them keep engaged in the economy and ultimately engaged in employment. And I'll make a push for the earned income tax credit, which is basically giving people paying people to work. So what you do is the government bumps up their wages. So if you're working, you get an additional bump up. And there's been some expansion, but not, kind of a full expansion of that to, an increase in that. And I think that's the best way to incentivize people to work. I will note that there was this whole debate, about extended unemployment insurance, lowering people's incentive to work during, kind of over the last year or two. And we had a great example where a bunch of states cut it, and their unemployment rates did not change any more than the unemployment rates of states who didn't cut the benefits. So that was a clear example that, and I with all due respect, that anecdotal evidence, is not, that the anecdote is not necessarily reflective of what's going on in the economy as a whole.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. And I hate we didn't get to all of the excellent questions that were submitted in the chat and to my email. But we're going to gather again for a conversation about next month's report. We'll be gathering November 4th. Again, between now and then, stay out on the lookout for more from my colleague, Rob Knapp. His contact information is going to be in the chat as well as in your follow-up. He is the right person to get in touch with if you'd like an embargoed copy of the report or to schedule an interview with any of our experts ahead of our new economic indicator launch later this month on October 18th. So we hope to see you in the coming weeks to talk more about that. And then again, November 4th for more on our next jobs report. Thank you again for joining, and take care.